All right. We are in the very last lesson of our current section. The current section is part 4, the controversy over the king. And of course, that was all about the rejection of Christ and everything else. So we spent a lot of time in this very section. So we're going to end that section 4 tonight, and we're going to start section 5 tonight as well. So we're going to be kind of in a brand new section of the life of Christ. Now that he's been rejected, now his focus is going to change, and we're going to see that pretty dramatically here. So we're going to end it though tonight with the account of the death of the Herald. And you can see here, this is the very last part of section number 4. And we're going to go ahead and start off here by reading it in Matthew chapter 14, verse 1 through 12. And it says this: At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Okay, that's Matthew's account. Then we've got Mark's account. Now, I'm only going to just touch on the yellow highlighted area because, again, we've got these synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that tell the story, but they all kind of, some of them will add a little bit of additional detail. So in Mark's account, it said, King Herod heard of Jesus, for Jesus' name had become known. Now, some said John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. That was one alternative. Like, okay, who is this Jesus? Well, he's John the Baptist raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. But others said he's Elijah. In other words, he's the Old Testament prophet. Others said he's a prophet like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." All right, so there's these different, it's either John the Baptist, or it's Elijah, or it's one of the Old Testament prophets. And the reason for that is because he's doing all these miraculous powers. And of course, those miraculous powers were things that happened, particularly with Elijah, Elisha, and Moses. Most of the prophets didn't do any miracles, except for those three were miracle workers, right? And of course, Herod seized John for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. So his brother is still alive, and yet he has taken his brother's wife. She's left him, and she's now married to Herod Antipas. And so Herod has John seized because John is preaching against this, this incestuous, adulterous relationship that is being had by Herodias and Herod Antipas, right? And it also says that in Herodias, now this is Herod Antipas's wife, and Herodias had a grudge against him, against John the Baptist, and wanted to put him to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. All right. Mark also adds that not only did Herodias' daughter, Salome, dancing, did it not only please Herod, but it also pleased his guests. So, there's obviously she was very good, and everyone was thoroughly enthralled with the dance that she was performing. And then it goes on to say, he says, and he vowed to her, this is to Salome, this is to the daughter of Herodias, "Whatever you ask me, I will give it to you." And this is something that Mark adds, "I will give to you up to half of my kingdom." Okay, that's a really rash oath just because someone's done this dancing really nice. So he gives this really rash oath. And she came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me," And she went to her mother for what should I ask? So in other words, she doesn't know. We don't know how old she is, but she doesn't know what to ask. So she asked Herodias, and of course Herodias up here, who has a grudge against him, says, hey, I want the head of John the Baptist. So Salome came in immediately with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. All right. And then immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head, and he went out and beheaded him in the prison. All right. So that's what Mark adds to that. Luke says at the very end of his, Luke doesn't provide us a whole lot of information about this, but he does said, Herod said, John I beheaded, but who is this about whom I hear such things? And he sought to see him. So, sought to see who? Jesus. Correct. So he thinks Jesus is John the Baptist, but he knows he's killed John the Baptist, so he's seeking to see him. Now, this part right here, this last part of the verse, actually ties into the very next thing we're going to cover tonight. So you're going to see, why is it that Jesus starts to do certain things? Well, it's because Herod is seeking to see him. That should remind you closely of his father Herod the Great, who was seeking to see the baby Jesus. Okay, that's not exactly something that you want to have happen with Herod seeking, and we'll get through the differences here on this. All right. So there we go. We got Matthew, Mark, and then we've got Luke. All right. Did you have a quick question?
Maybe you'll cover it in the next slide. I'll wait.
All right. Well, if not, yeah, we'll stop. Okay. Now, what is the timing of John the Baptist's ministry? So John the Baptist, obviously, ministry started before Christ. He was already baptizing people before Christ came to him for baptism, right? So John had been baptizing for a little bit. We don't know exactly how long John's ministry was, but likely it wasn't too much before Christ, because he'd been in the wilderness and he came back out. So right now, it looks like John had been, probably scholars say, around 12 to 14 months. He's been in this active ministry of baptizing and calling the nation to repentance and letting them know that the person that I'm going to point out to you is in fact the Messiah. That's his ministry. So about a year to maybe a little bit more than a year, he was in that. And then he's in prison for, scholars again look at that and they look at the different events in the life of Christ that happened and estimate that he was in prison somewhere between a year and a half to 2 years, right? So quite a while that he was imprisoned. And then the total time then, if you include his prison ministry as well as his free ministry, was somewhere between 2.5 to 3 years. Well, and that aligns with Christ. Christ was about 3, some scholars say 3.5 years for the ministry of Christ. So the Herald and the Messiah both have similar timings on their account. Now, so what we start seeing here is that Matthew tells us the sort of the timing. So when does this occur? Well, it says at that time. We're not exactly sure exactly at what that time, but we're going to find out in the very next episode that it's right before Passover, or before Passover. So it's pretty close to Passover time, as we'll find out. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is. Now here's the thing. The other, Mark and Luke, we have here where John the Baptist is one of the options. Well, apparently Matthew records that Herod had finally made up his mind, that in fact Jesus was John the Baptist, not just an option here. So this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. All right. So what we see here is this timing of the story here is that Herod, hasn't really met Jesus. As far as we know, he hasn't met Jesus. He hasn't really been exposed to Jesus, but he knows John the Baptist, not because he went out to be baptized by John, but because John publicly criticized him and Herodias' marriage and preached against that. So he doesn't exactly probably know the difference between them. To be honest with you, there wasn't the internet back then. You didn't have photographs, right? So unless you really had encountered someone, you might not know exactly what Jesus looks like compared to John the Baptist. So some people might say, well, gosh, you should easily be able to look at them and know the difference. Well, not really. We think of that because of how our environment is, where we can see those things quite clearly. Herod, who was a nominal convert to Judaism, really wasn't that interested in religious life. He was interested in political life. So likely he didn't pay much attention to either John the Baptist or to Jesus, and in this case, just assumed that they were the same person. Who? John the Baptist. Oh yeah, John the Baptist and Jesus were cousins. Yes, yes, and they might have even looked similar. It's possible, but I don't think that Herod had probably paid much attention to Jesus or run into him. Okay, because he clearly didn't understand that there was two of them that were alive at the same time. He made the assumption that there was one, John the Baptist, who had been killed, and so that leads scholars to believe that he really didn't have any interactions with Christ. And when he heard about Jesus, he just assumed it was John the Baptist.
So what it says, it said that John the Baptist was raised from the dead. What was he superstitious, or what? Were people believing in resurrection in those days? So it was not an unusual thing.
No. Yeah, I mean, we've gotten since the Enlightenment.
Right.
The Enlightenment basically put all of that. Put all that stuff to bed. Like all this religious stuff is just nonsense. It's just the way that the church has gone to sort of control people, whatever else. But we don't really believe in miracles.
Right.
That's all part of the Enlightenment, right? Locke and Hume and all those different people. But remember, this is all way back in the first century. In the first century, they certainly believed in gods. Now that doesn't mean that everybody did. Everyone,
right.
But in general, the populace was very open to the idea of God and to those types of things. Yeah.
Well, I meant the resurrection of the dead, because even Jesus said, well, you don't believe me this, and you wouldn't believe anybody, even if they were raised from the dead. So I kind of, how that fit in.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, resurrection was not common. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a sign, right? So it wasn't common, but you do have in the Old Testament, you do have the Old Testament different examples of people being raised from the dead. So it wouldn't have been unheard of that this had happened. And so, he made that conclusion. Now, he might have made that conclusion because it says others, probably advisors, people like that, where he's trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and they're offering different examples. And he's like, okay, this is John the Baptist. However he landed on that, he definitely believed that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. Yeah.
I'm just curious, this answered part of my, because I was trying to figure out what the timeline was like relative to Jesus's ministry, but Herod and Pontius Pilate are two, I'm guessing, political leaders in this area. What is like Pontius Pilate didn't want to kill Christ because there wasn't, I guess, just cause or something, and it sounded like it was a hot potato he was trying to get rid of, and the Jews weren't allowed to kill him. I got the impression.
Yeah.
And so kind of two questions. One is what is the relationship between Herod and Pontius Pilate, who was, the one that eventually killed Christ? And then the second part of the question is, my brain just went blank. Shoot. Never mind. Just the first part, like Pontius Pilate and Herod, like what politically, how do they relate to each other?
Yeah, I mean, so Herod, Herod was an Idumean, right? Idumea is the southern part right outside of Israel, the southern part of Israel. So Herod the Great was an Idumean, and their Herodian dynasty was, so they were nominal converts to Judaism, but they weren't Jews per se in that sense. But they were, Herod's kingdom was broken up and given, like Caligula, and the other Roman emperors would divide that region up, and they divided it between Herod's sons. So you have Herod Philip, you have Herod Antipas, you have Herod Archelaus, that they had different parts of Israel that they were sort of governing power. Think of them as a governor that had been sort of put in place as the people that would govern the Jewish people.
So was Pontius Pilate under Herod?
Well, Pontius Pilate is a Roman. Yeah, he's Rome's person. He's actually a Roman, and he's
Okay.
there in a political.
So are the Herods basically just, because if Rome controls all of this, are they basically just figureheads
They're
within the?
you heard it referred to as King Herod, but they're really more servant kings under the auspice of the emperor.
Okay.
Correct. And in fact, Herod, we'll find out later on, Herod was actually um, sent to Gaul because of a really massive military defeat, and so he's exiled to Gaul. So they're all under the Roman Empire.
The other part of the question was, if that's the case and the Jews didn't want to kill Christ because they didn't feel like they had the political power to do that, then how did Herod be able to behead?
Well, the Jews, in other words, the Pharisees, the rabbis, in other words, the Jews themselves, the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body, the Jews themselves, the ruling body, which was mostly composed of the Sadducees and Pharisees, they didn't, as Jews, they were not allowed to enact the capital punishment.
Right.
But Herod, being put in place by Rome,
So
and
Herod was actually a political
oh
appointee
yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. He
Okay.
and that's the reason why they had to go to Pilate even,
Right.
because Pilate was the one that had the Roman jurisdiction. He could and did regularly condemn people to death, but the Jews couldn't. That's why they had to come to him later on. All right, but anyway, we've got a couple brothers going on here in this story, so hang on just for a moment on some of that stuff. All right, so Herod Antipas, who is he? Going back to one of your questions here. Herod the Great, remember, was the crazy, maniacal ruler of that area that had been put in place there by Rome to rule. He was the one that had paranoia. He thought everybody was trying to kill him. He thought everyone was against him. He was also the one then, when he heard about the Messiah and the wise men came, he's the one that sent the guards and stuff to Bethlehem to kill every child that was 2 years and under. He was the one that God, through the angel, sent Moses, Jesus, and Joseph down to Egypt until he had died. So Herod the Great is the dad. Okay? Herod Antipas and Herod Philip, which are the two Herods in this one, they're his sons. And they've each been given, carved out an area of Israel to sort of rule under the auspices and control of Rome. There yeah, correct. Yeah, correct. Herod the Great, yeah, Herod the Great had lots of wives, and those wives and had kids. So they're half brothers. They're not full brothers. They had the same father, but they had different mothers. Right?
Did
So they
Herod
are.
Philip die and then
Nope.
Herod
No.
so Herod Antipas just cut
In fact, Jesus, our next story, Jesus is actually going to go into the territory ruled by Herod Philip, his brother. So you got these two half brothers here, and one of them, his wife leaves him, and she goes and marries the other brother. So that's the problem. That's the problem. Yeah, uncle. Yeah. So this is Herod the Great. Again, he wasn't really a king. He was more like what we call a client king or a servant king under the auspices of Rome. He did rule for quite a while. So you can see right here, he had, was it 43 years that he actually ruled. So he had a quite lengthy rule. Basically, 4 BC, somewhere around 4 BC is, actually in 4 BC is when Herod the Great died. So his sons then from 4 BC on took over this broken up sort of land of Israel, so to speak. Again, nominal convert to Judaism, which meant that he just basically did whatever he needed to do to keep the Jews from getting angry at him, but nothing more. Like he really wasn't interested in Judaism per se. All right. Now, again, the story of the death of the Herald, why is this being told? Why is this included in the account? Because by the time the story is being told in these gospel accounts, John's already dead. Like the story isn't being told because John has just died. John's been dead for some time. We don't know how long. So there's a purpose to the story, but it's not, the purpose isn't to tell us that this is the next sequence of events. Because remember, the last thing we studied was that Jesus had sent his disciples out in twos to go into the mission. And the way, if you just kind of read it, it's like, oh, they returned back, and then all of a sudden, Herod kills John the Baptist. Well, that's not the case. John the Baptist has been dead for some time, likely before they were sent out on the mission, and probably maybe even before Jesus was the unpardonable sin happened. We're not exactly sure. All right. So, but here's the deal. We know that that by the time this story is recounted in the Gospels, John the Baptist is already dead because Herod clearly says, I killed him. And now this is John the Baptist, and because he's doing all these miracles. So John the Baptist has been dead long enough that Jesus has been able to do plenty of miracles so that Herod thinks that what has happened is he's come back to life. So there's some distance between the death of Herod and when it's told in the gospel accounts. Does that all make sense from a timing perspective? All right. Well, there's some distance between when John the Baptist was actually killed and when the story is recorded in the Gospels. When the story is recorded in the Gospels is not when it happened in the Gospels. John has been dead for a while. Jesus has been doing miracles, enough miracles that Herod takes notice and thinks it's John the Baptist. So there's some amount of time there between those two, which is, like I said, why I think that John the Baptist was probably long dead before Jesus was the unpardonable sin happened and denied that he was the promised Messiah. Yes, you want to?
Was Jesus and John the Baptist ever together other than when he was baptized?
Well, the only other time would have been when Mary visits Elizabeth in the womb. Yeah, I mean, we don't know. The gospel accounts don't give us any kind of indication of whether they were close or hung out or anything at all. So this is really it. This is really it. Yeah. Okay. Back to where we're at here. Now, why? So, what is the purpose of this here? Then is that there is a desire on Herod's part. We get this kind of desire to see Jesus. Okay, that's the whole reason why this is being told here, because our next event is where Jesus leaves the territory of Herod Antipas to go to the territory of Herod Philip. And so this story is actually put in there to explain why Jesus moves from one territory to the next. And the reason why he moves is because Herod is seeking to see Jesus. Well, he's seeking to see Jesus because he thinks Jesus is John the Baptist, and I've already killed him once, and he's alive again. And guess what? Maybe I need to do the job again, right? That's a lot of what's going on here. And so the reason the story is inserted here is because Jesus is going to make a dramatic change in his ministry as far as location because Herod's now seeking him. Does that all make sense? Hopefully I made that clear and didn't get that too confused. All right. All right. All right, so let's, we know a little bit about Herod Antipas. How about Herodias? Herodias was royalty. She was part of the Herodian dynasty. Again, she was related to Herod the Great. Her father was, she was actually, boy, that's really bad. I didn't spell check that. She was the granddaughter of Herod the Great. Her father was Aristobulus, another son of Herod the Great. So you've got Aristobulus, you've got Philip, you've got Archelaus, you've got Antipas, right? So her father was Aristobulus, and Aristobulus was the son of Herod the Great's favorite wife, Mariamne. Now, Herod, getting all kind of crazy, Herod the Great, getting all kind of crazy and paranoid, he thought that his favorite wife, Mariamne, and his son, through her, Aristobulus, were seeking to take the throne from him. So he had both of them killed, and then later regretted that because it was his favorite wife, but had them both killed. So Herodias is the granddaughter. She is the daughter of Aristobulus and of Aristobulus, who was Herod the Great's son. All right. Now Herodias then marries Philip, which is also again a son of Herod the Great. This happens to be her half uncle, right? Because again, same father but different mothers, right? So she marries her half uncle. A little creepy. Then after being married to Philip, she leaves him. She actually becomes the mistress of somebody else, another uncle. And then finally she makes her way. this would be a movie. This would be some sort of a, I don't know. I don't know what this movie would be. I don't know. It's a movie. Yeah, boy. I've actually tried to do their family tree, and I'm telling you, it is hard. It's really hard because of all this mixing around. Anyway, so she finally then marries Herod Antipas, who is another son of Herod the Great, right? So Antipas is her another half uncle, so she likes to marry her uncles in this case. But she did it while Philip was still alive. So this now makes her an adulterer. There wasn't a valid reason for her to leave. I think you can, if you looked at her history, you can find out she's probably not the most committed. Yeah, wholesome, committed person. Okay?
Talk about Philip II by any chance?
This,
Yeah,
yeah.
Pastor Salome, she later married her other uncle.
Oh yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. I don't want to confuse because Philip II. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on here. But the whole point here is that she marries Antipas while, first of all, Antipas, his wife, still living. So you've got two people that marry when their spouses are still married and they're not divorced in a way that it would be acceptable under Jewish law, right? So here we've got Herodias, guilty of triple adultery, and then also 2 counts of incest. So it's not hard to imagine why John was like up in their grill. Like John was definitely preaching it, and they didn't like it, right? They did not like it at all. So that's kind of what precipitates this whole thing. Now, if we take a look at some of the things here that were violated, we can go back to Leviticus right here. In fact, all 4 of these are from Leviticus. Leviticus 18:15 through 16 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law." All right? "She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife." Well, there we go. Which is your brother's nakedness. Well, that's exactly what Herod did. Leviticus 20 says, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless." So again, there we go. So that's Antipas. So he violated Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Herodias, she violated Leviticus 18 and 20 as well in different ways. So Leviticus 18:12 to 14 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is, you shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt." Leviticus 20, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister or your father's sister, for that is to make naked one's relative. They shall bear their iniquity. If a man lies with his uncle's wife, he has uncovered his uncle's nakedness. They shall bear their sin. They shall die childless." So there's just a lot of grossness going on. And that's why John the Baptist calls him out, and of course ends up paying the price for that. And of course it says that Herodias held a grudge against him. She was angry and she wouldn't let it go, because I don't think John the Baptist let it go. I think John the Baptist kept on talking, and the more he talked, the more upset she got. And she was bound and determined to, here, why don't we just keep this back here and you guys can sort of pass that around.
I was just gonna mention that Jim Wright used to talk about when he was younger how he loved his sin and it was hard to come to Christ. And I mean, here's a perfect example. I wish I had a John the Baptist outside of my heart and in my mind to call me out on my daily sin, if you will, so I can repent and move closer to Christ. Where these people loved their sin so much they ended up killing the guy who was telling them they were sinners.
Yeah, I mean, most people, if you're not a believer, don't want to be called out on their sin. We see that regularly in society. I mean, don't dare call sin. Otherwise, you're angry and whatever else, and you're hateful. And it's like, no, I'm just saying that this is sin and it's not right, and I'm not going to support it. But yet, just in saying that, you're the most hateful person around. So anyway, she's no different, right? And of course, being part of the royal family, she's used to getting her way. So that makes it like there was certainly a way in which, being part of the aristocracy and part of this upper class, they were able to get away with things that would not have been tolerated in the general Jewish population, right? All right. Okay, so it says that Antipas was willing to arrest John, but he wasn't willing to have John killed. Well, we actually get a few different reasons why he didn't want to have John killed. And some of them almost feel a little like cross purposes, right? First one, Mark 6:19-20, it says, and Herodias had a grudge against him, wanted to put him to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John. So he was actually feared John because, known this, he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. So part of it is he knew he was righteous, he was holy, and he knew that that was just wrong. Like John did not deserve that. In fact, he knew that what John was saying was correct. I mean, so he knew that. That was part of it. It says here, when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. All right, well, the sense seems to be here that he heard him gladly. Well, that means that there, in some ways, he enjoyed talking to John the Baptist. He didn't enjoy getting called out on his sin, but enjoyed getting to know John the Baptist. He heard him gladly, probably because he knew that he was righteous, and if he was a prophet, he had power, right? And so he probably thought that there was some sort of an in or something intriguing about John the Baptist that way. But also he was perplexed. Well, why was he perplexed when he listened to John the Baptist? I think he was perplexed, although again, it doesn't say it's explicit here, is because he knows John's right, but he doesn't want to give up on a sin. Like he does what most people do and what we've all probably done ourselves, where we struggle for a while we want to continue doing what we want to do, and yet we know it's not right. And so there's like this internal battle that we all struggle with then when we know we're not living the way that we should be. And I think that that's part of this perplexing here. Now, the other thing, though, we get from Matthew. So he fears him because he's a righteous, holy man. But Matthew says, and though he wanted to put him to death. Okay, so there are times it appears that he actually wanted to kill him, but he didn't, right? Because why? He feared the people because they held him as a prophet. So now this is the political side of why he didn't kill him. Because if he killed John the Baptist, he was afraid that the people, and again the masses, held John to be a prophet. And if they held him to be a prophet and he kills him, then of course he's got a riot. Now, the one thing you never wanted to do as a ruler in that area for the Romans was to have a riot on your hands because you got exiled or killed. So it's part of also why Pontius Pilate is willing to give Barabbas instead of Jesus at the end, because to him, it's just a political calculation. I know I'm not doing the right thing, but I'd rather do that than have this crowd erupt in a riot, and then Rome comes and removes me from power, or worse, has me killed for not being able to control what's going on. So this is kind of this, you see this really kind of Herod Antipas is kind of complex, but it does say that he did want to have John killed. Now,
He did or did not?
he did. He did want him to be killed, but he feared John because John was righteous, and he also feared the people, right? Now, the beheading, the event, like we said, is Herod Antipas's birthday. So he's got his birthday. And Salome, or the Shulamite, again, this is the exact same name that we have for Solomon's wife, right? His wife, the Shulamite, right? She's dancing before the king, and they're having his big birthday bash. And it's interesting. Now, again, I want to try to keep this PG, and it's hard to tell, but this scene here is very reminiscent of Vashti, right? Remember Babylon, Esther, where Vashti refused to dance before the king said, "Come and dance." They're throwing a big party and whatever else. So
That was Esther?
Esther. So there,
Esther?
yes, there seems to be a little bit of, at least there's a similar
Isn't it
type of
that-
thing going on here. Whether or not there was anything inappropriate in the dance is different. Vashti, there clearly was indiscretion that was being requested of her, and she refused. Okay. All right. Anyway, so she's doing this. She's dancing. She delights them all, and then Herod, I don't know, probably might have been drunk. Who knows if he was drunk? Who knows? Anyway, he makes this really rash vow to her that she can have anything up to half of his kingdom, right? Okay, so this is his promise. She doesn't know what to do, so she goes and asks her mom. And of course, her mom, who has this grudge, says, hey, asking for John the Baptist ahead. Don't just kill John the Baptist. Notice, again, this is weird. Herodias is strange. She's messed up. She doesn't just want John killed. She wants John killed, and then I want his head delivered on a platter to me. I want to stick it over here in the corner of my room and just look at that all day. I mean, there's something really macabre about the whole idea of what she is asking for here. So Salome says, great. She, with haste, the text says with haste. She didn't even be like, oh gosh, mom, I don't know, that doesn't sound really good. Or, I mean, I'd rather ask for a pony than, the head, but none of this. Like, she immediately runs off and does this. And then it says that Herod was exceedingly sorrowful and grieved at having to fulfill the request. This is where Herod is really odd. It's odd because at one point he definitely wants to kill him, but at other points when it happens, he's actually grieved and sorrowful that it has in fact occurred. Now, whether or not this is sorrow because he thinks now he's going to have this whole political fallout on his hands, or whether he's sad because he executed a righteous man, not entirely clear. But he does keep his oath. He does have John beheaded. Okay. Yep. Well, John the Baptist was calling out Herodias and Herod Antipas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he made it public, and they did not like it, and so yeah.
It's kind of funny though, but Herod did, after all this was over, he did say to John's disciples, yeah, take him away and bury him.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, correct. But hey, he allowed him to take away the body, not the head, though.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, boy, I tell you, John's disciples, that's another thing. Yes, there's a question back there. One more.
What do you say to the fact that Herod offered Salome half of his kingdom, which is a lot of power, but she turns and asks her mother, what do you want me to do? I mean,
She's young. I mean,
naive, just basically.
yeah, and it's
dead.
probably on the spot. Like, you can have everything up to half my kingdom. I mean, I'm assuming that that's what it is. And again, whether or not Herod actually could have even fulfilled the request is a completely different story, because he was appointed by Rome.
Right.
You didn't just give power and control unless Rome allowed you to do it. So it was a rash oath, likely because it was a birthday festival, likely the wine was flowing, and people say things and do things that they later regret. All right. Now, the question we have to ask is, can Herod then be held accountable for John's death since he made an oath, right? I mean, should we look at this and say Herod is responsible because he didn't know what he was promising until the request had been made, right? And the answer to that is, so on one hand, someone could say, well, you can't hold Herod accountable. Like, he promised he would do something, and then someone came up with a ridiculous request, and it's an oath, right? The Bible says if you make an oath, you must keep it, right?
It's causing you to sin.
But yes, okay, so yes, but theoretically, someone could argue that we shouldn't hold Herod accountable because he didn't know what he's going to be requested until after he'd made the oath. Now, that is, of course, the rabbis did write about this, and they did say, and this right here is a quote from the Midrash. So this is the Jewish writers. It's not biblical or anything else, but this is the rabbis looking at the Old Testament and then making some determinations about vows. Could you break your vow? Because the Bible is really clear. The Old Testament is clear. You keep your vow. You make your vow, you keep your vow. There's only a few little exceptions in the Old Testament to that. So here's what they said. They said 4 types of vows did sages declare not binding. 1, a vow of incitement. 2, vows of exaggeration. 3, vows made in error. And 4, vows broken under constraint. Now, we're only going to cover number 1. Basically, vows of exaggeration would be things like, man, I'd give everything for that ice cream bar. Man, it's so hot. Well, that's a vow of exaggeration. I mean, no one expects. So they said, look, that's just hyperbole. It's not a true vow in that sense, right? It's exaggeration. Vows made in error, you could sit there and say, no, I swear Like, I saw so and so run across the street and rob that person. Well, it could be that it was actually night, bad lighting, whatever else. And in fact, you might vow to something that you made in error and later find out that that person was in a different country. Like, there's like, you made the vow in error, right? It was with good intention and you thought you were doing it the right way, but there was something erroneous in the error that you had made. Um, and then there were vows broken under constraint. That would be compulsion. Like, someone's holding a gun to your head and then say, promise me you'll do X, Y, Z. I mean, that's under constraint. They would say, look, vows made under compulsion like that were not valid, right? And we would agree with that. I mean, no one would hold that against them. Vows of incitement, though, are vows of, you're encouraged to do something through some interaction, right? It's not under compulsion. You're not compelled to do it, but some sort of interaction. This clearly was what was going on here. She's dancing. He says, hey, there's no compulsion. He's not making it in error unless you think that he was drunk, right? So this vows of incitement. Well, this is what they said. Vows of incitement, how so? If one was selling, here's their reasoning. Here's the logic. This is the rabbis writing here. If one was selling something and said, Konam, if I chop the price down for you under a selah, and the other says, Konam, if I pay you more than a shekel. In other words, two people are trying to buy something. One says, hey, look, if you bring that price down under a selah, I'll buy it. And the other says, hey, if you pay more than a shekel, I'll sell it, right? Or, that whole thing. There's an exchange going on here, right? D, then both of them agree at 3 dinars, which would be middle ground. So hey, look, if you do this, I'll sell it to you. Well, if you do this, I'll buy it. That's a vow, but in fact, the price you actually end up paying and agreeing on is something different, right? So that's just, you're encouraged to do something other than what you promised originally, right?
Sounds like eBay.
Yeah, probably, yeah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Jacob says, also he who wants to force his fellow by a vow to eat with him says, any vow which I am going to vow is null so long as he's mindful at the moment of his vow. So this is basically, hey, you know what, you come have dinner with me? Sure, yeah, I'll have dinner with you. I don't really want to have dinner with you, but I didn't really mean it to didn't really, you're not compulsed in this case, but you didn't really mean it as long as when you made the vow, you knew you didn't mean it. Sort of like this whole thing of crossing your fingers and holding behind your back, right? That type of idea. And further did Rabbi Meir say they unloose his vow by reference to what is written in the Torah, saying to him, and this is going back, Gray, what you were saying. If you had known that you would transgress the commandment, you shall not take vengeance, or you shall not bear a grudge, or you shall not hate your brother in your heart, or you shall love your neighbor as yourself, or that your brother may live with you, would you have taken such a vow? Right? The answer is, of course not. I mean, I wouldn't have committed to that if I'd known that what I was going to have to do was to break God's law, right? Now, what happens if he becomes poor and you will be unable to help him out? And he says, if I had known that matters were thus, I should never have taken such a vow. Lo, this vow is loosed. So anything that would then come back when people actually detail out what that vow means, or you find out what the vow actually really means, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it meant that, they would loose that. So in this case, Herod can be held accountable because he did have the opportunity here. He made a very rash vow that could have, again, it would have violated this part down here, because obviously it would have been killing a righteous person. So we can't let Herod off the hook, even though some people want to do that. Yes, quickly, yes.
Real quickly, God said that if you hate someone in your heart, you've committed murder.
Mm-hmm.
And so he should be held accountable on what God said, because in Matthew, it says here that Herod wanted to kill John. So he already had malice in his heart.
Correct.
And therefore, he's a murderer.
Yeah, according to the standards of Jesus.
Right?
Correct.
Wouldn't you say
100%.
that?
Yeah. Okay, so what's the aftermath here? Of course, John's head gets placed on this platter, delivered to Salome. Salome then turns around and gives it to Herodias so she can put it next to her lampstand in bed, look at it every night as she goes to sleep. Yeah, what a gal. Man, whoever's the next husband up for her, man, she's a keeper. She is a keeper. Yeah, she's a keeper. All right. The interesting thing about this, I would point out that this story of beheading is the only one that you have in Jewish literature, except for the one related to Esther. Right now, when I say Jewish literature, I don't mean the Old Testament. When the rabbis wrote about the story of Esther, they actually added some stuff to it, and in that account, there is a beheading that happened. So beheading was not what happened. The Jews didn't behead. They stoned, the Romans crucified. So this beheading is a very weird, to your point, weird and out of the ordinary way of killing. There's something very gross and very dark and disturbed about the request to not only have him beheaded, but then to have that delivered on a platter. Okay, so that's my whole point here. Is this is the only one other than this other incident in Jewish literature of that time. So Locke says this in his rabbinic commentary. He says this is unknown. This idea of beheading in Jewish literature outside of one example. According to the Midrash, Memucan told the king that he should have the head of the disobedient Vashti brought in on a platter. This is particularly interesting since the Mark passage, the Markan parallel to this passage, Mark 6:23, has Herod swearing, "Whatever you ask of me, I will give you even half of my kingdom." And this is right out of Esther, right? So if you go back to Esther, so the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." So it's very interesting that the rabbis associated this request to have Vashti beheaded because of a very similar thing, a dancing request, in this case, a dancing request denied, and that the king responds by saying, "I will do whatever you want me to do up to half my kingdom." So the parallels there are very striking between John the Baptist and this one. Now, again, John's disciples are allowed to retrieve the body, not the head, and bury the body. And then Matthew 14:12 says that they informed Jesus of John's death. Now, we don't hear Jesus' response, but I can just imagine if you were put in Jesus' spot, the emotions he must have been feeling, the deep sorrow, the anger at what had happened. We don't have an accounting of that in the Gospels, but this must have been a pretty dramatic, intense, emotional time when it was reported to Jesus about John's death. All right, now, a couple things as we sort of finish this off here. What happened to Herod and Herodias and Salome because of this, right? So, well, yeah, nothing good. Okay, Herod Antipas. Josephus does give us an account of the death of John the Baptist. So actually, Josephus writes about John the Baptist and his death. And what he says in this is that the Jews, because Herod had killed John the Baptist, that the Jews believed that Herod's great military defeat was God's divine judgment. So that they said God got him back for killing this prophet Elijah. And this is what Josephus actually says in his book, The Antiquities. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism, for that the washing with water would be acceptable to him, if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. Now, when many others came in crowds about him, for they were very greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion. So Josephus is saying that what he believes happened here historically is that Herod feared that because John was so immensely popular with the crowds that he was speaking publicly against Herod, that actually John the Baptist was raising up a rebellion. And so Herod wanted to kill him because he did not want a political rival, is what is actually being said. For they seemed ready to do anything he, John the Baptist, should advise. Thought it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not to bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it should be too late. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews have had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure to him. Okay, so that is the account that we have of Josephus, right? Now, we also know from Josephus that Herod Antipas was exiled to Gaul by Emperor Caligula because his nephew, Herod Antipas's nephew, Agrippa I, accused Herod of sedition. And so Caligula had him exiled to Gaul, and Herod later died in Gaul. Now, Herodias accompanied Herod into the exile, and she died there as well. All right, so not a great ending for Herod Antipas. How about Salome, the girl? Okay, well, as you said, she married her uncle Philip II, right? Keep it all in family, right? When there's remember the show All in the Family? Okay, there you go, All in Family. And then very soon after this marriage to Philip II died. She then became a widow. Again, she's very young at this age, so she's now a widow. And then we've got two differing accounts. It's hard to tell exactly which one is correct, right? One of the accounts says that she died of a very hideous, painful, grotesque disease, right? The other one says that she drowned while crossing a frozen river. Now, this one's actually was one reported by the historian. What is his name? Anyway, I'll get to it here. It's in there. He reported this, and it's interesting because you'll see that when she drowned, but only up to her neck. So in other words, her body was under the ice, her neck and head was above the ice, and the ice came and cut her and sliced off her head. So she dies by squiggling around, and the ice literally cuts her head off, and she's beheaded. Okay, that's the story here. So this is actually the stories it's told. Wherefore the just vengeance of God burned against all who were concerned in this crime. Herod was defeated by Aretas. Afterwards he was banished with Herodias to Lyons and deprived of his tetrarchy and everything by Caligula at the instigation of Agrippa, the brother of Herodias, as Josephus relates. Moreover, the head of the dancing daughter was cut off by means of ice. Hear what Nicephorus says. As she was journeying once in the wintertime and a frozen river had to be crossed on foot, the ice broke beneath her, not without the providence of God. Straightway she sank down up to her neck. This made her dance and wiggle about with all the lower parts of her body, not on land, but in the water. Her wicked head was glazed with ice, and at length severed from her body by the sharp edges, not of iron, but of the frozen water. Thus in the very ice she displayed the dance of death, and furnished a spectacle to all who behold it, which brought to mind what she had done. Here also L. Dexter, in his chronicles, Herod Antipas, with Herodias, his incestuous mistress, was banished first to Gaul, and afterwards to Idaria in Spain. Herodias danced upon the river Sicoris. When it was frozen, fell through the ice, and perished miserably. So, there you go. I kind of like the second one better because it's, I mean, you talk if you were to actually, this would make a great movie. You know what I'm talking about? Like, you know, this make it. You don't get much more justice than that. So that is the end of that.
So she was kind of a prophetess then, wasn't she?
Well, she didn't proclaim truth. She just did something, and it happened. Very quickly, because I do want to get to the feeding of the 5,000 here.
Then, never mind.
Okay.
Okay. Well, keep your.
His questions are more important than mine.
Well, ask your question. Ask your question.
I have all recordings. You talk about more.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. And then when we're all done, we'll get there. All right. Now, this last one here is we're going to get into a brand new section. This is part 5. So we've just left part 4, which is the controversy of the king. Part 5 is now this new section of the life of Christ called the training of the 12. And the whole purpose of this section is for him to train his disciples for what they are going to have to do. So basically we've got 26 different accounts within this section. We start out with the feeding of the 5,000. All right. Now, again, this feeding of the 5,000 takes place right after his disciples return back from their ministry. They were sent on Tuesday, they return back. And the only reason why we are told about the account of John the Baptist is because the feeding of the 5,000 takes place outside of Herod Antipas's territory. Okay? So it's the reason he had to leave, and it's the reason why the feeding of the 5,000 took place in Gentile territory versus Jewish territory. All right? Now, Matthew 14, 1 through 12. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. This is, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You know what?
Yeah.
What in
Going
the,
backwards.
what in the world? Okay, hold on a sec here. Hold on. Nope, hold on.
Matthew 14, 13 through 21.
No, hold on here. I forgot to bring up my latest deck here. That's what's going on. Yeah.
You
I-
are
I've-
forgiven. You are forgiven.
Well, this is, yeah, I forgot. It's my fault. Apologize. Let's find out where this is at here. There we go. Okay, now we're on it here. Okay. Can you guys still see it online? You can, right?
Anybody?
I see a small portion there.
Yeah, okay, hold on here. Slideshow from current slide. Okay, what do you see now here? Let me see. You got
Okay,
it.
that's good.
Okay, all right. Apologize for that. It's been a rough day.
You're doing great, Randy.
All right, well, I'll tell you what. Can you guys all see that? Okay, thank
Barely.
you.
Barely.
What was that?
No, it's fine.
Okay. All right, so we have here, hold on here. Yeah. Apologize for this. Okay, there we go. Okay, we're all good.
We're done.
All right. This next section, section number 5, lasts for about 6 months. It gives us the time frame. It's from the Passover to the Feast of Tabernacles. So we've got a 6-month period we're going to be studying coming up here. During this period, Jesus makes 4 trips out into Gentile territory. Now, he hasn't really done this much at all before, but now he makes 4 extensive trips out into Gentile territory. Well, the reason for that is because he needs to get away from Herod Antipas. And so he goes out into Herod Philip's territory, which is comprised much of Gentiles. Even though it would be part of the land of Israel, it was settled by Gentiles, heavily Gentile. All right. Again, it's because Herod thinks that Jesus is John the Baptist. All right. These journeys place Jesus under the jurisdiction of Herod Philip II, Philip the Tetrarch. And again, son of the Herod the Great, half-brother of Antipas, and he ruled the northeastern part of Israel. And again, this region was actually pretty sparse, less populated, didn't have as much commerce and things like that. It was more mountainous, and there was a very small Jewish population compared to Herod Antipas's area that you'll see here. So I don't know if you can see this, but this orange part here, that is Herod Antipas's area. So Galilee, Capernaum, right, Tiberias, all this Nazareth, this whole area over here is all in Herod Antipas's control, right? Down here in this yellow, this is all part of Archelaus. So he controlled, Jerusalem and Judea and all this area down here. So he had a much bigger area of control. And then you've got over here, you've got Herod Philip, the Tetrarch. This purple area is where Jesus is going. So he's going to leave Herod Antipas's region and he's going to go over here. But of course, this is now on the, when you get to the other side, the east side of the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee, that's where you get into all of this Gentile area, right? In fact, that's Gadara right there. We talked about the Gadarenes. Remember that? The 2 men that were demon-possessed by a legion of demons. So he's now moving into this purple area, right? Now, the main purpose, as you're going to see, when we go through this, Jesus continually instructs his disciples. You're going to see that for the most part, his attention turns away from teaching the crowds to teaching and training his disciples because he has very little time left, right? Jesus has about a year left in his life. It says that this feeding of the 5,000 was near the Passover, according to John 6:3-4. And that makes it the third Passover of his ministry, right? So his ministry right now is about 2 years old, and then he'll die within the next year. So this happens at Passover. Of course, he dies within a year at the fourth Passover. So he's got a year left, and a year left to teach his disciples, because he knows he's going away. He knows he's dying, and so he's got to get them ready. Now, if you think about the disciples, up to this point, they've done nothing. I mean, they've done diddly. All they do is just follow him around. I mean, Jesus is the one that does the healing, Jesus does everything. They're just literally following and watching. Now, with him sending them out on the 2x2s as part of that mission to start to evangelize, he's now going to take this next section to say, I need you guys to step up. I'm going to take off the training wheels. And so part of what he's going to do here is to teach them how they are going to need to be responsible and what that mission looks like, so that when he dies, then they are ready to take over. All
Randall,
right.
when they went out on their 2x2 mission, didn't they come back to him and say, we did everything you told us
Yeah.
to do, we performed miracles,
Yeah,
and so that was a great learning experience for them.
it was, but they need to learn. That was the start of it.
Yeah.
They need to now learn a lot more. And so even the feeding the 5,000 isn't really designed for the people at all. It wasn't a miracle for them. It was a miracle for the disciples. Right. And we'll see that here.
Is this the only time he did 5,000, or was there another
There's a 4,000 as well.
4,000?
Yeah. So, and people get those confused, thinking it's one. There's not. There's two separates. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to quickly read through this here in the different accounts. Now, there's 4 accounts here, so let me just try to read through this as fast as I can. Matthew's account says this: Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. And what he means by when Jesus heard this, it's the report back from the disciples when they came back from their mission and that they'd been successful, right? So when he heard that, but when the crowds heard, they followed him on foot from towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. But Jesus said, They need not go away. You give them something to eat. They said to him, We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, Bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So that's Matthew's account. Now, Mark, he adds that the occurrence of this is that the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. So they returned back from the mission. That's how we know when this happens, right? And then in verse 33, it says, Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So the disciples are coming back, and they run with them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them, because they were, and this is the part that Mark adds here, the people were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And then down in verse 38, Mark adds, And he said to them, How many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s, and taking all 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. Now Luke adds, on the return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida, right? So that's where they're at, in Bethsaida. And the crowds then hear that they're in Bethsaida, which is why they then need to get into a boat to go across to the other side of Galilee, right? That's what's going on here. Now the day began to wear away, and the 12 came to him and said, Send the crowd away to go into the surrounding villages and countryside to find lodging and get provisions, for we are here in a desolate place. So Luke adds the idea of not just food, but also lodging. And then John says that now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, so this is the only one that records Philip. Jesus said to Philip, Where are we to buy bread so that these people may have eat? He said this to test him, for he knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. And then John adds here, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So yeah, put them all together, and there's a lot of information here. All right, very quickly. Again, this miracle is unique because it is the only miracle outside of the resurrection of Christ himself. Outside of the resurrection, this is the only miracle actually recorded by all 4 gospel writers. All the rest of them are only recorded by 1, 2, or 3. Okay? This is also the 4th of John's 7 signs. So John has 7 signs that he gives. Those signs are there to prove the deity and the messiahship of Christ. This is his 4th sign that he gives. And the purpose of this miracle is not really for the crowds, right? It's for his disciples. Now we'll see how the lesson is applied in our very next thing that we talk about next week. So he's going to do a miracle, but the actual application of the miracle comes very clear next week. So kind of hold on to this here. And again, what we've seen here is that the event is the disciples have returned, but they're hungry. They're exhausted. It says, Jesus said, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and they had no leisure even to eat." So in other words, they've come back from this long mission, and there's so many people coming, and Jesus is healing. There's so much going on that the disciples don't even have a chance to eat. So he says, look, we got to get away. Got to get away? Southwest Airlines, right? Got to get away. He said, we got to get away. And this is kind of a sub note here on this whole thing, that if even Jesus needed a chance, a break from ministry and a break from people, and needed time to recharge, then we do too. And some people don't recognize that. There is a legitimate reason to say, look, for this period of my life, I'm going to do a little recharge. And it's okay to do that because Jesus himself had to do that. All right.
Plus he was mourning over the death
Yeah, I want to make sure I get through this.
of John the Baptist.
Yeah, okay. The location of the miracle. Where's it at? Well, Mark and Matthew say they withdrew by boat to a desert place. So it's a desert area, which of course the east side of the Lake of Galilee, Sea of Galilee would have been that way. John says it was on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, so this puts them in Gentile territory. And of course, the town they went to was Bethsaida. And of course, this puts them in Herod Philip II's jurisdiction. Now, by boat, the disciples and Jesus took a boat. It would have been 4 to 5 miles. And if you had a decent wind, that wouldn't have taken you too much to get over there. But by foot, it's 10 miles. So these people followed them 10 miles around the lake to get to them. Okay? That is a long way to walk. So I just want you to keep this in mind, that when these people are sitting there, they sit down and Jesus teaches for some amount of time. And at the very end of that, it says the day's been spent. Well, it's been spent because it's taken them probably 2 to 3 hours minimum to walk from one side of the lake to the other. And then by the time they get there, Jesus is teaching. By the time they're done, these people are hungry. They're hangry. They need a Snickers, right? That's what's going on right here. Okay? This is the first of the 4 withdrawals into this Gentile territory, all right? And one thing we do realize here, although this will quickly change, this is going to quickly change here, that despite the Pharisees' rejection of Jesus on the ground of demon possession, the crowds still are following him. That is really going to change here because of how Jesus addresses them coming up very shortly. All right. Now, this again is not intended to, by this miracle wasn't even part of the plan. Normally we see sometimes Jesus is planning to do something. I'm not saying he didn't know it was going to happen, but this really wasn't his plan. His plan was to get away. They actually wanted to get away from the crowds, but they ended up being, in this massive crowd, right? He does use it as an opportunity for teaching. And we also see, though, that even though Jesus and his disciples are dead tired, hungry, Jesus still has compassion. Like, it's just amazing. You see here in Mark 6:34, when he went ashore and saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things, right? Now, the reason why they were sheep without a shepherd is pretty clear, because, again, the rejection of Christ has just happened, literally probably weeks or so before. It's not that long ago. And now the people are struggling with the question, who is Jesus? Is he this promised Messiah that John the Baptist said? And that does all these miracles? Or is he a demon-possessed lunatic that the Pharisees have put out there? So they're still following him, but they don't know which shepherd. There's two shepherds here, Jesus and the religious leaders, and they're like sheep without a shepherd. They don't know which shepherd to follow. That's the problem. So he looks at them and he has compassion because he understands what they are in fact teaching here. All right, so Jesus teaches the masses. By the time it's finished, the day is basically done. And that, of course, then is what precipitates the miracle. These people are hungry and they're tired. They need food and they need water, right? Okay. Now, here's the teaching to the disciples. Now, we notice after he's done teaching the crowd, he didn't say anything to the crowd anymore. His conversations are all about the disciples because he wants the disciples to learn some different things here, right? If you pay attention to this, the disciples express a need, but they've got no way to fill it. So they turn to Jesus. And what does Jesus normally do for them? He just does it. He just does it. Jesus, do something. But Jesus says, you do it. And their response is, it's impossible. We can't do that. That was his command. And so then the lesson is for them. And of course, that's the lesson that's being taught. I'm going to ask you to go do something. Well, we can't do it. Well, yes, you can do it, but I'm asking you to go do it, right? And so this is part of their training. They're going to come from the shadows of Christ, and he's going to sort of thrust them out there from a ministry perspective to learn, because eventually they're going to have to take over for him. So this is the first one where he really has a chance to do that. All right. While he's talking and they're asking about this whole stuff, Jesus turns to one person, Philip, and he asks him, in John 6:6, hey, Philip, where can we buy bread? Okay. And then it says that he asked this of Philip to test him, to prove him. He knew exactly what he was going to do, but he wanted to test Philip to see what Philip would in fact say. Of course, the reason why he turns to Philip is because John 1:44 tells us that this is Philip's home territory. So if anyone's going to know where to buy food, if anyone's going to want to know where there's lodging at, it's going to be Philip. And of course, Philip's like, you're crazy. I know this area. There is not, like, you ever been to like a road trip and you go to like a small town and there's literally not a McDonald's or anything? It's like, Joe's Shack, and like there's not a Motel 6. It's like, some sleeper motel or whatever else. Like, you would know if you're out in the middle of Montana or someplace like that, you would know we're not going to find what you need here, right? This is what Philip is. Like, they're in a desolate place. It's desert. There's not a lot of people. It's not populated. So Jesus asked him, Philip, we're going to buy food. He knows that Philip's going to say, you're crazy. Can't do it, right? In fact, Philip says there's not enough food available in the area, even if they had the money to buy it. And of course, Philip knows that they don't even have the money to buy it, even if the food was available. So it's kind of like this, it's we don't have the money, but we also don't have the food. So Jesus, I don't know what you're asking us to do because it's not possible. And then Philip goes on to say that even 200 denarian, or denarius in Latin, would be insufficient to pay for the bread, right? Now, denarian, it was 1 day's wage. So basically, Philip is saying, hey, look, if I just took what I could earn for 200 days, that wouldn't be enough to buy the food for this, for the people to live on, right? And just to give you an example of how much that is, 1 denarius would buy 10 quarts of wheat or 30 quarts of barley. So 200 would get you 200 quarts of wheat or 600 quarts of barley, right? That's the amount of that. Now, that may seem like a lot, but when you've got 5,000 plus people, that's not really a lot of food.
That was just men, and then.
Yeah.
The Bible says plus women and children.
Correct.
So there could be what, 7,000, 10,000?
Oh, well, probably way more than that. If you think of men and their wives, and then they typically had big families back there, it's probably
Okay.
5 times more than. I mean, we don't know exactly how big it was, but it was significantly more than 5,000. Yeah. All right. Okay. So so Andrew joins the conversation while Jesus is talking to Philip, and then Jesus tells Andrew, "You go out and you figure it out," right? And Andrew comes back and says, well, the only thing I could find are 2 fish and 5 loaves of barley from this boy. And then Jesus says, okay, fine. Go divide them up into groups of hundreds and groups of 50 and sit them down on the grass. Again, people look at this and say, well, I thought it was a desert. It is a desert, but in the springtime, it's green, right? Springtime, it's green. In fact, I've been to Africa, and sometimes you go to Africa, and I've been there in the spring and in the summer, and it can go from green to dry in no time, right? So Jesus then sits him down. He blesses the bread, which is a typical Jewish way to do it, to give the blessing over the bread. And then the crowd sits down. They're able to eat their entire fill, right? It's interesting that there isn't any indication, at least from the text itself, that they knew that there was a miracle that occurred. But I think probably most of them knew that a miracle occurred just because, that's a lot of food to be able to provide. And we were all sitting here for a while, and we didn't see any food trucks pull up. So, but there isn't anything there isn't anything directly that states that they knew that from the account. Jesus then also tells them to get the baskets full so that nothing will be lost. And they end up getting 12 baskets of the fish and bread. And of course, that 12 is very symbolic, either representing the 12 tribes of Israel, but in this case, more likely it's the 12 apostles. I've sent you to do something. I'm going to tell you I can provide for you, even when you tell me I'm crazy and it can't be done. And then there's going to be enough so it's a basket for each one of you that has the leftovers, right? As a means of showing, when I tell you to go do something, I can provide for you. Each one of you has a basket, not just a basket, but 12 baskets, one for each one of the apostles.
Put that together.
Yeah, and then the enormity of the miracle, as you were saying here, it's 5,000 men and women, although, 5,000 men, as Matthew specifies, but he then says that did not include women and children. So this was significantly greater than that. And then one thing to kind of keep in mind here is that Jesus creates food that doesn't exist. So most of his miracles are miracles on things that are here, like a broken body. Someone's sick and he heals them, right? A demon or whatever else. Here he takes the loaves and fish, but then he creates food that doesn't currently exist. He's not dividing up food that already exists. Does that make sense? So this actually harkens back to the Genesis account of basically creating something out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. Now, last thing here, and then I think we'll be done, and I've got time for some questions here. We're going to learn what the lesson is in much more detail when we come to the next event, because Jesus is actually going to apply it to them. And it's kind of embarrassing, to be honest with you, that he did all of this and they still didn't grasp it, and so he has to kind of come back and explain it to them. But just from this, there's at least these three things that we should get from the text. First of all, it's the disciples that are responsible for feeding the crowd. Like, for the first time, Jesus asked the disciples to go do something. Normally, they've just been waiting. Oh, there goes Jesus again. Oh, he's healing some. Oh, he's raising some from the dead. Look what Jesus is doing. They're hanging out in the background. And now all of a sudden he goes, oh, no, hold on a second here. You go do it. And you go do it. And you can imagine they're like, oh, what do you want me to do, right? They're to feed the crowd, in this case, literally, but of course, in the future, they're going to have to feed spiritually. That's what they're going to have to end up doing. The other thing they have to learn is they're incapable on their own. So he recognizes that. He's going to ask them to do an impossible task. They know they can't do it. And so they're going to have to rely on him in this case and in the future for the task. And so this is a way of him sort of pulling the self-dependence that they have out from underneath them and telling them they have to lean on him. Now this right here, this is the one they don't learn. They don't learn this one right here, that they've got to lean on him. We'll see that in just a moment. And then also, they were to distribute to the crowds what the Messiah gave them. So not only are they to feed, but whatever the Messiah gives them, they're then to be the distributors of that. So in this case, it's food now. Later, it's going to be spiritual to stop. It's going to be the kingdom of God, the Christendom that Christ has been talking about, that they're responsible for then bringing out to the crowds. Okay, what questions do you have? Sorry about the fastness here, but I got distracted with my tech issue. Yeah.
It's irrelevant, but it isn't. Fish. How you feed what kind, raw fish? I mean, I just can't picture. Was it cooked or prepared? Sushi.
It would have been it would have been dried and salted.
Dried salted.
Yeah. In fact,
It's puzzled me.
You know,
In fact, what would happen is you had the fish market, so the fishermen bring it in,
Okay.
and then the fish is actually prepared there, so you take it home. You didn't really prepare it yourself.
Right.
Same thing like the butchers you would have where they would do that. They would dress it. They would do the dressing for you, and then you would take the meat home. Yeah. Rich, you had a question.
Well, it goes back to that lovely tale you took us through, Herod and his girlfriends, whatever you want to call them. That whole, what,
Make sure you the
oh,
mic. Yeah.
when you took us through that, and I was listening to all these gruesome details, and the beheading of John the Baptist, it seems, I mean, it's just obvious and not, this is an understatement, but it seemed demonic. It's like a demonic, some scheme of Satan
Hmm.
behind the scenes to not only kill, I mean, what did killing John the Baptist prove? I mean, or what did it accomplish?
To whom?
To
Well,
just-
to Herodias, she's just angry at him. Like for her, it's just
Is that it?
vengeance. Oh, it's just vengeance. Yeah,
Woman
she
scorn?
well, she hated
Woman
him and
scorn?
wanted him dead. Like for her, that's it. It didn't. There's nothing to prove. It was just, I'm going to kill him. I hate him. That was just pure hatred.
And then Fruchtenbaum said that uh, that the death of John the Baptist, Yeshua moved toward his own coming death.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It just, it just seems really evil and demonic. I mean, again, that's so obvious, but well,
No, I think, Rich, to be honest with you, the demonic. First of all, the demonic activity during that first century seems to be, from what we can tell, much more extensive than at other times in history. Well, that's because the Messiah is here. And so Satan and his demons are going to try to do everything they can to sidetrack that whole thing. They know John is the forerunner. They know how important he is. And so the text doesn't state it, but I would not be surprised at all that that was Satan that put it into Herodias' heart. I mean, that would not surprise me in the slightest.
just real quick,
oh.
I had underlined in each of the Gospels that there were 12 baskets left over.
Yeah.
And I never thought about the fact that there's going to be one basket for each of the apostles after the fact.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
it's amazing to me. I mean, you mentioned that, and it's like, well, that makes sense. And so not only did he do it for all the people, he's like, here, you guys,
Yeah,
you've done a great job out on the road.
Yeah.
And you're starving, you're hungry.
and they're full. The baskets were full
Yeah,
too.
this will hold you
So
over.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, it could have been one basket or three baskets. Or I mean, the symbolism in the Bible should not be. It's not coincidental, right? Yeah. Great.
I'm still confused about how Herod would think John the Baptist came back to life. Like you mentioned, there's probably more demonic influence at that time. But it still seems kind of strange to me that you would actually be paranoid that someone had come back from the dead.
Well, again, yeah, I mean, coming back from the dead is very, very unique, obviously. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a sign. But, people back during that time were certainly much more open to the spiritual world, to those ideas. The gods were in control of everything, the weather and I mean, so in other words, they're very much into those types of things. If there is a miraculous event, it's an act of God. Right. And so the person doing that, there's some influence, either God or demonic activity. So, I mean, they would have understood that versus most people today would be like, oh, well, maybe the doctors just didn't, they got it wrong. And, he's whatever else kind of thing. Like, so there's a general openness to that. But the other part is that Herod likely didn't pay much attention to the goings on. Again, he was all politically motivated. You take a look at his career. The Herods, that's what they were. They were a product of their father. Yeah, but they're not interested in what some religious figure over here is saying. They're not really, but he starts to hear stuff, but again, he likely has never seen John and Jesus together. So to him,
Could be like, oh, maybe I got
no, the text doesn't tell us exactly why he made the connection, but it does say that some said that this is John the Baptist. So what I think happened is he's trying to explain there's this guy over here doing this stuff, and I know about this other guy that was doing this stuff, John the Baptist, and these advisors that know more about it than I'm a politician, that these advisors are telling me this, and so some are saying that, and he came to that conclusion that this person that I just killed has come back from the dead, right? I mean, Jesus already raised a girl back from the dead. So coming back from the dead was not common, but it wasn't out of the question. Like if someone today said, so and so came back from the dead, we would all be scratching our head and saying, like, okay, where's the doctored photo or whatever. I mean, there'd be a lot going on. It was much easier for him to accept that fact from potentially others that this is actually what was going on. Yeah.
Real quick
Yeah.
question. How do you square all the verses in Leviticus that you brought up about, it's wrong to sleep with your brother's wife and all that with the inevitable start of humanity with Cain and Abel? And they had to have, started humanity by sleeping with their sisters.
How do I square that? Well, first of all, I'll start off by saying some believe that Adam and Eve were not the first humans. They were just the humans selected out of the population God had created to be his representatives. And he put them into the Garden of Eden because this Garden of Eden was God's essential, his footstool. That's where his tabernacle was. And at the time, that's where he came in and fellowshiped. And Adam and Eve were his representatives. And they were then to take that and work through humanity to do that. And there's some actual biblical reasons to believe that, in fact, that is probably more the case than Adam and Eve being the first ones. I'm not saying which position I hold. I'm just saying that if you hold to that position, then in fact, when it says Cain goes to all these towns and he tells God, don't do it because I'm going to be murdered, but yet he goes to towns and finds wives, towns don't exist and cities don't exist unless there's more than you and
people in them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some. So if you hold that view, there's no problem at all because you truly just, Adam and Eve were representatives, and that's why God called them on to do that, to be his representatives. Now, if you do believe that Adam and Eve were the first ones, then you just got a matter of necessity. I mean, that's just, you got to start somehow.
Got to start somehow.
But then once it gets to a certain stage, then God says, look,
rules.
well, yeah, there's rules. So there's he's got, in fact, since God didn't give the Mosaic law until Moses, you've got thousands of years in which there weren't any restrictions against that. And again, if it's a matter of necessity, then God knows exactly when necessity ends and when a division and law around certain activities need to be put in place. So I don't see a problem either way with that.
Well, if you think about it, one of the conflicts, if Adam and Eve were perfect in every way, once sin came in, there was a curse put on mankind. And so over time, it says after Cain and Adam and Eve had many children. So what were they doing? You could have had thousands of children and be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. So by definition, well, you had to marry your sister. And then when the
out of necessity
kicked in, eventually it got to be a point where you don't marry your sister, because even today, that's for Leviticus came in, okay, we changed things now. So that makes more sense to me. I mean,
I mean,
yeah, business, but that's fine.
No. I'm not saying you have to. I'm just saying that some conservative evangelical scholars actually look at the text and they would hold that view. If you hold that view, then you've got no issues at all. But if you hold the other view, you still don't have any issues because out of necessity, you've got to do that.
You don't really have any idea how old Cain and Abel were when Cain killed Abel, right?
No,
They could have already had lots of
So, I mean, the text doesn't state, but, they, first of all, they were old enough to make moral decisions and to offer sacrifices and to be working out in the field, or, be a herdsman, or, to work out in the field to be a farmer. So they were old enough to do that. And then Cain, when he flees, he's old enough, obviously, to get married and to reproduce.
Right.
So they're not 4 or 5. So likely the Cain and Abel story happens at some time either in their early to late youth or sometime after that. Like, we really don't know how far after that whole thing. They could have been much older than that, but they certainly weren't. It wasn't that they had Cain and Abel and then a year or two later this whole thing happens. Like, there's some amount of time that's passed. Yeah, correct. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We will see you next week. Appreciate it.
Anybody else would it don't live 600 years, so.
Yeah.